Mother weeps desperately, begging for a miracle during her son's funeral, but then she's shocked to hear a knock from inside the coffin. William's family had always been an example of success and respect. Susan, a determined and visionary woman, firmly ran the family's large business, making every decision with strategy and precision. Her husband, Charles, was the lawyer responsible for all the corporation's legal matters, ensuring everything was conducted according to the law. William, their only son, was a bright, responsible and respected young man who from an early age showed a talent for business, following in his parents' footsteps with discipline and dedication. Despite their immense fortune and status, they maintained a discreet posture. They never flaunted their wealth, but they also never made money a means to help those in need. The few donations they made were occasional, without genuine involvement. They claimed to be a family of faith, but they were never practitioners. Their prayers were rare, empty, just words without true devotion. They lived a comfortable and stable life, certain that nothing could shake what they had built. But fate, relentless, would make them question everything they believed. That morning, William descended the mansion's stairs with firm steps and a calm smile on his face. He wore a spotless suit as usual and carried a small leather briefcase by his side. The business trip he was going on was simple, just a routine commitment with no expected complications. Upon entering the living room, he found his mother sitting on the sofa. "I'm leaving, Mom," William said, adjusting the strap of his briefcase and pausing for a moment at the entrance of the room. Susan, sitting on the sofa with a pile of documents in front of her, raised her eyes and looked at him for a moment before offering a faint smile. "Be careful on the road, son. Don't rush and let me know when you arrive," she said, with her always controlled and assured voice. "I will," William replied, walking over to her and planting a brief kiss on her forehead. Charles, who was sitting in an armchair near the fireplace, reviewing some papers, looked up over his glasses. "Have a good trip, son," he said with his usual calmness. "Thanks, Dad," William said, before grabbing the car keys from the table and walking to the door. Charles and Susan remained inside the house. The sound of the engine echoed through the entrance, and they both just watched as the car disappeared down the road. A few minutes of silence passed before Charles finally closed the folder of documents and adjusted his tie. "I'm going too," he said, looking at his wife. Susan sighed, setting the papers aside for a moment. "Today is going to be a long day," she said, massaging her temples. "As always," Charles replied, grabbing the briefcase from the table. He approached her and lightly touched her shoulder. "Don't overwork yourself." Susan gave a small smile without much enthusiasm. "See you tonight." Charles simply nodded, grabbed the car keys, and left through the front door, walking with firm steps, not looking back. Hours passed. Susan went about her usual routine. She reviewed contracts, made important calls, and organized future meetings. Charles was in the office, dealing with the legal complexities of the business, as he did every day. Nothing seemed out of place. Then, the phone rang. The sound echoed through the quiet room. Susan, still focused on the papers in front of her, reached out and answered without hurry. "Hello?" she said, distracted. "Mrs. Susan?" The voice on the other end was tense, filled with urgency. "Yes, who is this?" she asked, furrowing her brow slightly. "I'm from the hospital. Your son, William, has had a serious accident." Time stopped. The words didn't make sense. Her heart raced and her hand trembled involuntarily. "What?" she said, her voice shaky. "What accident? What do you mean?" The voice on the other end hesitated for a moment before continuing. "We ask that you come to the hospital immediately. He was brought in critical condition." The phone slipped from her hand and fell onto the carpet. Her body went stiff, her chest tight with a pain she couldn't name. Her eyes widened, and for a moment, everything around her seemed to lose its color. With trembling fingers, she picked up the phone again and dialed Charles's number. Her heart was pounding as she waited for the call to be answered. "Susan?" said Charles on the other end, his voice busy as always. "Charles." Her voice failed her, and a sob escaped before she could continue. "It's William. He's had an accident. They said it's serious. We have to go to the hospital now." There was a pause on the other end. For a moment, there was only heavy, frightening silence. Then Charles's voice came through differently, lower, as though he was trying to process the information. "I'm on my way," he said, without asking any more questions. Susan dropped the phone and quickly grabbed her purse. Her steps were unsteady, and her hands still trembled as she grabbed the car keys. She drove without thinking, not caring about signs or speed limits. Her only thought was to reach the hospital. When she parked, she rushed out of the car, almost stumbling over her own feet. She ran through the cold, white hallways, her heart racing, feeling as though at any moment her body might collapse. Upon reaching the reception, her words came out in a whirlwind. "My son, William. Where is he?" she asked, almost breathless. The receptionist hesitated. "Are you the mother of patient William?" "Yes. Where is he? Tell me now." "Please follow me," the woman said, and began walking down the corridor. Susan could barely keep up. Her legs felt weak, and fear made her chest hurt as though it was being crushed. Turning a corner, she saw Charles, who had just arrived. His face was pale and his eyes wide with concern. "Charles!" she cried, running towards him. He grabbed her shoulders as if to give her stability, but he himself seemed on the verge of breaking. "What happened? What did they say?" Before she could answer, a door opened, and a man in a white coat appeared. His expression was serious, stern, and his eyes carried something Susan didn't want to decipher. "Mr. and Mrs., the doctor said, "please come with me." The couple exchanged glances and followed the man to a secluded room. Susan felt the air growing heavier around her. The silence was unbearable. She wanted to scream, to demand answers before her mind drove her mad. When the door closed, the doctor remained silent for a brief moment. His gaze was heavy, as though each word he was about to say was a difficult burden to bear. He took a deep breath, like someone who had given this kind of news countless times, but never got used to the weight of it. "Mr. and Mrs., he said slowly, choosing his words with caution. "We did everything we could. We fought with all available resources, tried every procedure, every viable medical intervention, but his condition was critical from the start." He paused briefly, watching their faces. Susan was paralyzed, her eyes wide, breathing irregularly. Charles, on the other hand, maintained a stoic expression, but his rigid posture betrayed the tension building up in every muscle of his body. The doctor's voice became quieter when he finally said, "William didn't make it." Reality shattered. Susan blinked a few times, as if trying to process the meaning of the words she had just heard. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The air around her seemed to vanish, and a suffocating sensation took over her chest. Her knees buckled, and if Charles hadn't been there to hold her, she would have fallen to the ground. "No, no," she murmured, her voice coming out in a fragile whisper, as if denying it could make everything disappear. Tears began to stream down her face, hot and silent, wetting her skin without her even realizing. The hospital around her disappeared, turning into a shapeless blur, without form, color, or sound. All that existed was the pain. A pain she never imagined could be felt. Charles, in contrast, remained still. His gaze was fixed on the ground, expressionless. He didn't cry, didn't speak, didn't react. He just stood there, frozen, as if his soul had been ripped from his body. Inside, chaos roared, but outwardly, he was a man empty of everything. The doctor kept talking, mentioning medical details that made no sense now, technical terms, explanations. words that sounded like distant noises. Nothing mattered. Nothing could change what had already been done. The following days passed like an endless nightmare. The house, once full of life, became a tomb. Silence spread through the corridors like a permanent shadow, turning every corner into a cruel reminder of the absence. William's room remained untouched. Every object, every piece of clothing, every photograph were open wounds that would never heal. Susan couldn't sleep. She couldn't eat. Her mind rejected reality, refusing to accept that she would never hear her son's voice again, that she would never see his smile or feel his embrace. Every tick of the clock was a torture, a ruthless reminder that time kept moving, indifferent to her suffering. And then, the moment she feared most arrived. The funeral for her son was approaching, and nothing in the world could have prepared her for it. Susan had never felt such a crushing weight on her shoulders as she did that day. Everything inside her screamed for her to not go through with it, to find a way to escape, to stop that reality from becoming true. But there was no escape. Charles was by her side, wearing a pristine black suit, but his face was pale and his eyes hollow, betraying the pain he refused to show. He didn't say anything. He didn't hold her hand. He just walked beside her, like a shadow, like a man who no longer had the strength to react. The black car that carried them stopped in front of the entrance to the large funeral hall. The sun was hidden behind thick clouds, and a cold wind blew, as if the sky itself shared in the sorrow that consumed their hearts. Susan didn't want to get out of the car. She didn't want to face what awaited her beyond that door. But Charles opened the door and stepped out first. He turned to her, waiting without saying a word. With a trembling movement, she finally got out. Her steps were hesitant, almost dragged, as though every meter she moved was taking her into an abyss from which she would never escape. Upon entering the hall, she felt the weight of the eyes on her. The funeral room was filled with people, acquaintances, company employees, William's friends, distant relatives. But to Susan, they were just indistinct shadows, mere presences that held no significance in the emptiness that consumed her soul. The low murmur of conversations died down when she passed, but none of that mattered. Nothing mattered except the coffin in front of her. The closed coffin. That was the cruelest of all. The fact that she couldn't see her son's face one more time, that she couldn't touch him, that she couldn't confirm with her own eyes that he was there. An insurmountable barrier between her and the truth she still refused to accept. She couldn't hear the comforting words some tried to offer. She only heard a distant hum, as though she were submerged. Her mind was far away, in another time, in another reality, where William was still alive, where that moment had never come. Susan. Charles's voice sounded low beside her. She blinked a few times, feeling her chest rise and fall in an erratic rhythm. She wanted to say something, but there were no words. Charles didn't insist. He himself seemed incapable of speaking more than that. Time passed in a distorted way. She didn't know if minutes or hours had passed since they had arrived. People came and went, offering condolences, patting her shoulder, saying phrases that made no sense. Nothing could cut through the fog of pain that enveloped her. Then, the moment of farewell came. The priest leading the ceremony spoke the final words, and the weight in Susan's chest became unbearable. Her body could no longer endure the pain that was crushing her. She felt her knees give out, and before she could hold herself together, she collapsed onto the coffin. "No, no," she murmured, her voice trembling, almost powerless. Her arms wrapped around the coffin as though somehow she could feel William inside it. The cold wood was a cruel contrast to the warmth she remembered from her son's body, from the life that once pulsed within him. In uncontrollable tears, her face soaked the smooth, dark surface. Susan cried uncontrollably, her sobs shaking her body. Her forehead rested against the cold wood of the coffin, and her fingers trembled as they grasped the smooth, polished surface. Her mind, once skeptical and rational, now screamed in despair. "My God, please!" Her thoughts echoed amid the chaos of her pain. "If there is a miracle, let it happen now. If you truly are merciful, if you hear the cry of a mother, then do not let me continue living this torture." Her heart pounded fast, a silent plea forming inside her soul. For the first time, her prayers were not empty. They were not mechanical rituals without meaning. They were real, urgent, the only thing she could hold on to. "Take everything from me, Lord, my wealth, my position, my security. Take it all. Leave me with nothing. Reduce me to dust if necessary. But do not leave me without my son." Desperation grew in her mind, her thoughts becoming more intense, fervent, desperate. "I was never a woman of faith. I never sought you truly. But now I beg you, hear me, give me a sign. Bring back my son. Show me that you are real." She closed her eyes tightly, sobbing in broken breaths. Her tears soaked the coffin, and inside her a conviction formed. For the first time, she believed, for the first time her faith was complete. She clung to the impossible, the improbable, for there was nothing left but that. Then she heard it. A muffled sound, weak but unmistakable. Her sobs stopped instantly, and her heart raced. The silence in the room seemed absolute, but she knew what she had heard. She stood still, as though waiting for her own mind to play a cruel trick on her. And then she heard it again. A knock, coming from the coffin. Terror and hope collided within her like a crashing wave. Her breath was caught in her throat, and she widened her eyes, feeling a chill run up her spine. "Charles!" she screamed without hesitation. Her husband, who had been standing beside her, paused for a second to react. His eyes, which had been lost in the void, widened in confusion. "What's wrong?" "I heard..." Her voice faltered, but her expression was one of utter desperation. "I heard a knock." Charles furrowed his brow, clearly trying to understand what she was saying, but then, before he could respond, it happened again. A knock, coming from inside the coffin. Panic spread like wildfire through the room. Some people exchanged glances, uneasy, not sure if they had heard the same thing. Whispers began to rise, growing louder. "This is impossible," said a voice from somewhere in the crowd. "Was it the wind?" another suggested hesitantly. But Susan knew. She knew she wasn't imagining things. "Open the coffin," she screamed, her voice full of desperate certainty. No one moved immediately. The shock was too great. Even the priest, who had been leading the ceremony moments before, seemed frozen in place. "Open it now," she insisted, her voice teetering on hysteria. Charles, still in shock, looked at one of the funeral home staff. "Do what she said," he said, his voice firm but his eyes filled with fear. Two men hurried to the coffin. Their hands trembled as they unlocked the lid. The silence that fell over the room was deafening. Everyone held their breath. When they finally opened the coffin, what they saw was something they could never have imagined. William was there, alive, his eyes wide, his breath labored, his body too weak for any sudden movement, but his consciousness still intact. He tried to speak, but his voice came out hoarse, almost inaudible. Chaos erupted in the funeral hall. Shouts of shock echoed through the room. Some people stepped back, as if they couldn't believe what they were seeing. Others ran toward William, trying to understand the impossible. "He's alive!" someone shouted. "Call an ambulance!" another voice echoed. Susan, tears and astonishment filling her, brought her hands to her mouth, trembling from head to toe. "My God," she murmured, falling to her knees. William was there, against all odds, against logic, against science. A true miracle. The chaos continued to engulf the funeral hall when the shrill sound of an ambulance broke the tumult. The double doors flew open with violence, and two paramedics hurried inside, pushing a stretcher. The voices around them blurred into a sea of murmurs and stunned exclamations. "Make way!" ordered one of the paramedics as he approached the open coffin. His eyes widened as he saw William there, breathing with difficulty, pale and sweaty, but clearly alive. "This is impossible," murmured the other paramedic as he checked his vitals. "We need to take him immediately," said the first, before turning to Susan and Charles. "We'll take your son to the hospital for urgent tests. You can come with us." Susan, still trembling, held William's cold hand as the paramedics carefully placed him on the stretcher. "Son," she whispered, her eyes brimming with tears. William blinked slowly, too weak to respond, but his fingers weakly squeezed his mother's hand, a sign that he could hear her. Charles, who had remained paralyzed until then, finally snapped out of his daze and stepped forward. "I'll go with him," he said, his voice cracked but firm. "I'm going too," Susan said, her hand unwilling to let go of her son's. The paramedics nodded, and they quickly moved William to the ambulance. Inside, the heart monitor registered weak but steady beats. Susan and Charles barely blinked, watching each movement of the medics while holding their breath. "We'll do everything possible," said one of the paramedics, but Susan already knew. There was nothing science could explain. The miracle had already happened. When they arrived at the hospital, a whole team of doctors and nurses was waiting at the emergency entrance. The unit's director, a grey-haired man with a stern expression, frowned when he saw William being removed from the ambulance. "This can't be right," he murmured to one of the doctors beside him. "The reports showed confirmed death." "We don't have time for questions now," replied one of the nurses. "We need to stabilize him." Susan and Charles were stopped from following them into the examination room. They stood there, frozen in the cold hallway, looking through the small window in the door as doctors rushed around William, connecting him to machines and administering medications. Time passed slowly and torturously. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, the hospital director came out of the room, holding a medical chart, his face filled with confusion. "Mrs. Susan, Mr. Charles," he began hesitantly. "I know this doesn't make sense. Your son, he had been declared dead. The death certificate was signed by one of our own doctors. His heart stopped. All protocols were followed, but now he's alive." Susan looked at her husband and saw in his eyes the same certainty that burned within her. "It's a miracle," Susan said without hesitation. The director opened his mouth to respond, but no rational explanation came to mind. He simply nodded, slowly closing the chart. The following days were filled with recovery. William, though weak, showed no lasting effects. Tests indicated that he was perfectly healthy, as if nothing had happened. Susan never questioned it, never doubted. The moment her son opened his eyes inside that coffin, she understood the meaning of the miracle granted to her, and she also understood that her promise hadn't been just words thrown to the wind. And she would pay the price. Without hesitation, she sold all of her shares in the company, letting go of the empire she had spent years building. She made every transaction without regret, without looking back. Every asset, every property, every investment carefully planned over the years was undone without a single weight on her heart. The family mansion, a symbol of luxury and power, was the last to be handed over. As she walked through the empty house, she felt a lightness she never imagined was possible. "Are you sure?" Charles asked, watching her with caution. "More than ever," Susan replied, her voice unwavering. Charles remained silent for a moment, then nodded. "Then let's go." The family moved to a modest house, far from the excesses and appearances that once surrounded them. Charles continued working as a lawyer, but now only as an employee, with no involvement in the business. William, with his intelligence and experience, found a new job quickly. and Susan found a new purpose. With the remaining money, she founded an organization focused on helping those in need. Orphaned children found shelter. Homeless people received a second chance. The sick had access to treatment. Even abandoned animals found protection and care. For the first time, her wealth had a true purpose, something that went beyond profit and family stability. Every penny, every effort, every hour of work was dedicated to helping those who were once invisible to her. And for the first time, she understood the real meaning of gratitude. The days were now different. There were no more exhausting meetings to increase profits, no more concerns about status or power. There was only simplicity, peace, the true meaning of living. Each dawn, when she opened her eyes and saw William alive, when she heard his laughter echo through their modest home, when she felt the warmth of a home not driven by ambition, but by love, Susan understood. That wasn't just a miracle that brought William back. It was a miracle that brought her back to faith, back to purpose, back to a life that, for the first time, was truly lived. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, give it a like, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. See you in the next story.